Ladies and gentlemen, here is an exceptionally disturbing true crime story that raises age-old questions. Is rural life safer for your children than city life? Were neighbors in the 19th century more trustworthy than the 20th and 21st? Do the questions even matter, since it all depends on certain circumstances and the cruel fact that an evil person in any century and any location can stay hidden from all until the moment he or she indulges their desires? Let us return to those days of yesteryear, to a distant corner of Missouri on a brilliant summer day, when the loudest noises you are likely to hear if you were walking down the dirt road in the middle of the afternoon were the insects, the birds, the occasional horse, cow, or dog, maybe a gunshot or shots as people hunted game and shot targets for recreation, and lastly, if the conditions were right, you might hear the distant and lonely steam whistle from a passing train. On Sunday, August 31st, 1884, two little girls from a large family named McLaughlin went for a walk in Flag Springs, Andrew County. Their names were Ostie, age 9, and Adela, nicknamed Deli, age 7. People described them as pretty and unusually intelligent. The area was quite rural as it is today. The girls had gone out together in the afternoon to visit one of their playmates at the Bateman house, the home of another family and about a 1.5 mile walk from their home. The area was a patchwork of woods, cornfields, pastures, a creek, a tiny cemetery, and here and there farmhouses, barns, outbuildings, and cabins. That's it. There is no town in the area. So off the little girls went, and one account says that upon finding that their young friend was not at home, only an older brother named Oliver and his sister Libby, the girls left to go looking for hazelnuts in a cornfield along the way home. Another account claims all 4 Bateman children were at home when the girls arrived. Whatever the case, it is certain that the girls did visit the Bateman house for a time and then left around 2 or 3 p.m. The afternoon drew on, and the girls' family expected the nice little sisters would be along soon to brighten the home with their happy smiles. When neither child returned home, the whole family became alarmed. Word was sent out, and a search was undertaken as the sun set in the west. Surely the sisters had just wandered away and became lost, but in what direction? The other Bateman family members, having returned home, joined in the search, that is, except for 22-year-old Oliver, who had fallen ill, so his parents insisted he stay home. Adding to everyone's worry, the 2 little girls made no answer when called. It then became too dark to continue searching. Everyone returned home and waited for earliest light. The next morning, the shocking horror of their pitiable and lifeless bodies were found in a cornfield by one of the searchers, Mrs. Meeks. First one body and then the other. People rushed in to get a glimpse. The cornfield was along the road the girls would have taken home between the Batemans' home and their own. One newspaper described the scene this way: the children were discovered the next day, carved and mangled to a degree simply horrible. The crime was shocking beyond all words. This was 1884. Jack the Ripper would not be known until 4 years later in London, and even he did not mutilate children. The condition of the bodies was as follows. 9-year-old Ostie had been shot in the head at close range and her clothes removed. Her torso had been ripped open with 3 deep slashes from a sharp-edged instrument exposing her intestines. There was a small abrasion on her right side. Her 7-year-old sister Adela had her jugular vein severed. In fact, both sides of her neck had been savagely cut open, the sharp instrument having plunged first into one side of the neck, removed, and then the other. Osti appeared to be the object of the attack, and yet for some reason the younger girl had been carried off about 100 yards in the cornfield. Some reports said 175 yards, and then laid down on an ash pile, almost as if she was a sacrifice. Perhaps the reason Adela was so far distant is that she ran away only to be caught and killed. Osti may have been moved around during or after the attack. Where found, her arms and legs flung out. Next to Osti's body, a boot print was found and measured. Down at a nearby creek, a spot was found where someone had washed the blood off themselves and their clothing. No weapons were found. How could so awful a thing happen in such a quiet, rural corner of Missouri? Why were the children hurt so violently? Were there two killers, one with a knife, one with a gun, one who stayed with Osti, one who carried Adela further away? People were immediately out for blood, and it didn't take long for suspicion to fall upon Newton Bateman, 18 years old and one of the searchers from the Bateman family. Rumors spread that he was an enemy of the girl's father, and that he had once tried to entice a girl to go with him into the very same cornfield where the murdered girls' bodies were found. This circumstantial evidence was slim. However, he was taken by the sheriff for his own safety to the county jail in Savannah because the gathering crowds were calling for his death. Oh, and an innocent African-American man was put in jail too, well, just because they could or should for his own protection. The mob grew and threatened to drag Newton out of the jail and lynch him as more and more people poured into town hoping to see the spectacle. There was just one thing. Newton's boot size did not fit the print. Being that there was not enough evidence to go on, and that he proclaimed his innocence, Newton was freed. Next, the investigation focused on his older brother Oliver, who himself was voluntarily brought to the Savannah jail for his protection. Oddly enough, his boot size did match the print. He denied having anything to do with the murders and claimed to be both sick and drunk on the day of the murders. Asked if he thought he knew who did it, he said that he knew several hard cases, meaning some rough guy was behind the murders, not a meek and harmless fellow like himself. All the while he maintained a very cool and calm composure under questioning. He likewise appeared to sleep easy in the jail, even though loud voices were calling for his lynching. He was, after all, the last to see the little girls alive. He stated in his interview that after Osti and Adela left from their visit at the house, he went to the barn and watched them walk away. Shortly after, he fell asleep. His sister said he stayed home as well, though she didn't really see him for the rest of the afternoon. Oliver had an unusual history. Here is what one paper gathered about him. Oliver had been sick for a month before the murder. The last work he did was during harvest. He is his mother's favorite, while Newton is liked best by the father. Oliver is the oldest child and has always been puny and weak. Very frequently he was unable to work more than a week during the season. This year he farmed on shares with his father. His shares of the crops will amount to several $100s. He owns a splendid 3-year-old span of gray horses and has considerable stock of various kinds. Oliver was a recluse in habits. He never attended a dance in his life, never was known to utter an oath. Quiet in habits, he never drank, went out late of nights, nor associated with bad company. He had never been regarded as a bad boy by the neighbors, but on the contrary, had always borne a good name. He had the entire confidence of his parents, who humored his every wish. He never associated with boys his own age, but always with them several years younger. He was modest and retiring, shunned female society, and was the last person to be suspected of this crime. Well, I'm sure you'll agree those are some interesting attributes, and given the time period of the murders, he certainly didn't seem like a troublemaker or a criminal running around with the wrong crowd. On the other hand, his inability to work for very long while falling back on an unspecified condition raises a red flag. He seems to have either been prone to some type of serious illness causing him weakness, or his symptoms were psychosomatic, perhaps owing to ongoing psychological conflict, or he was faking it to avoid work and adult responsibilities. On the other hand, he did not go looking for trouble, and for whatever reason, he avoided women and men his own age. This is unusual because, as you've probably heard, people married young in those days. Well, continuing, the papers, now falling on gossip, reported a couple of other details that for them seem strangely outside of the decorum of the time that one would expect. One, that Oliver was born before his parents were married, and two, that neither Oliver nor his brother Newton were intelligent. Their education was sadly neglected, was how one put it. However, that appears to have been all so much talk, since the children had a basic public education and no doubt grew up diligently reading the one book at home nearly every family read, the Bible. In contrast to the suggestion that he was poorly educated, another paper said that he was adequately educated and of average intelligence, so who knows what to make of the education reporting. Perhaps more seriously, the papers provided a little background on the family with the following. Bateman's father is a man about 55 years of age. His mother is about 45 years of age. Both are conscientious, God-fearing people, strict members of the Baptist Church, and their daily walk in life has always been beyond reproach. Oliver himself is a member of the Baptist Church, but not now in good standing. He said he had made up his mind some time ago that he could not be good enough to be a church member and had gone back on the church. He was born in Wisconsin, and when a baby, his parents moved to Missouri on the farm his father now owns, 125 acres, and here all his brothers and sisters were born, and here he has grown to manhood's estate. He has said that until last winter he has always gone to school since he has been old enough. His father is strictly a temperance man and never allowed any liquor in the house. End of quote. Oddly enough for a strict family, on the day of the murders when Oliver claimed to be sick, he said he got a hold of some alcohol from a drunken young man he saw riding a horse past the house with a bottle of whiskey sticking out of his pocket. Oliver said he threatened to sick his dogs on the young man if he did not hand over the liquor. This is how he claimed to obtain liquor on the same Sunday afternoon that two little girls were brutally murdered. Was the nameless drunken horseman the murderer? Was he one of the hard cases that Oliver spoke of? We'll leave that question alone for now and learn what the autopsies told the sheriff. A .32 caliber bullet was removed from the left side of Ostie's skull from a depth of 5 inches. The bullet was mangled, but knowing the caliber narrowed the weapon. She also had a small abrasion on her right side belly that the examining physician thought was of no great matter considering the brain injury and the horrible knife wounds on her body, which were deep. Hence the doctor performing the autopsy said she was killed by gunshot to the head, and her sister Adela from having her throat stabbed on opposite sides of her neck, each cut a depth of approximately 2 inches. After the autopsy, the girls were brought home, dressed, and buried in the lonely Flag Spring Cemetery. The grief was terrible, and word spread in all directions. People were beside themselves. The investigation continued, and soon it was learned that Oliver, the mild oldest son of the Batemans now in jail for his protection, was the owner of an unusual double-barreled pistol. One barrel shot .32 caliber, and one shot the smaller .22 caliber. They had not seen a .22 caliber wound on the body of either girl, but remembered the first doctor's report of the small abrasion on Ostie's right side external abdomen. The prosecuting attorney and a second doctor decided that the body of Ostie should be exhumed and the side abrasion checked for a bullet. Up from the grave, her body arose for a second examination. The doctor probed the side abrasion, or entrance wound, which is a better way to describe it. He followed the path of the wound and found a .22 caliber bullet near her spine. The bullet was removed and put into evidence. Then the body was buried again. The hunt was on for Oliver's pistol. The Bateman house and yard was searched. Oliver's unique double-barreled pistol was found buried in a cloth in the yard. It was determined that it had been recently fired. A pocket knife presumed to have killed Adela was found on a rafter inside the house. When questioned, Oliver claimed he buried the gun to hide it from his father, who opposed him owning a firearm. A little strange, though, since he was a grown man on a farm and not allowed to own a gun, but that is what he claimed. While technically in 1884 it was near impossible to prove who used a knife or a gun, fingerprinting was still years away. The investigators took into evidence one more item that would be hard to excuse. A shirt of Oliver's was found with poorly washed bloodstains. When confronted with all the evidence and becoming quite afraid of the crowds pouring into Savannah calling for his lynching, he stopped denying it and made a confession to John Lincoln, sheriff of Andrew County, Missouri, on September 8, 1884. Also present was J.C. Brooks, clerk of the circuit court, and Thomas H. Ensor, deputy clerk, who took down the confession. The newspapers actually published two confessions with different wording, and so I'm going to combine both confessions to get a better picture of what he says happened in the cornfield. It's worth noting that after the official confessions, there were a few interviews with reporters in which Oliver didn't reveal a lot, but in one area seemed to challenge his own confession. He elaborated on the drinking as an excuse, but he never produced any evidence in support of his claim. Again, please understand the following contains the words of two confessions, and as such, some of the sentences will overlap and the information will be repeated in a slightly different way. These are his words, and they read as follows. My name is Oliver H. Bateman. I was 22 years old August 4th last. I was drinking Sunday. Got my liquor from a stranger who was passing. I was sick and took it in order to feel better. Last Sunday, a week ago, I was at home when McLaughlin's little girls came there. I had no ill feelings toward the girls. On the contrary, I always liked them, as did all who knew them. They left our house at 2 o'clock to go home. 15 minutes after they started home Sunday, I went, as I stated before, to the barn lot, intending to go to sleep in the haymow. I saw the girls from the barn lot going around the corner. I saw the little girls at corner by Knappenberger's. Did not start from home for 15 minutes afterward. I went through the woods, straight to Dr. Lockett's cornfield. I started after them, even then having no thought of harming them. I overtook them along the road by the cornfield. At that time they were both over in the field gathering hazelnuts. The little girls were just inside the fence. I climbed the fence and began talking to them. Still, I had no idea I would harm them. I went to them, told them they need not be scared, talked with them half an hour. While talking, persuaded them to go further into the corn. I enticed them farther over into the cornfield and made proposals to the eldest girl which she repelled in a most indignant manner. With that, we all started back towards the road. I saw Harry Knappenberger pass going to singing. When within a short distance from the fence, I concluded I would murder the oldest girl because she had refused to gratify my desires. I was drunk at the time. I pointed my revolver at the girl and fired the .22 bullet into her body, the right side. She didn't fall, but turned and looked me full in the face. I fired again, this time the .32 bullet hitting her in the head. She fell and died almost instantly. The other little girl then started to run. I followed and caught her. I did not hit her. She begged me to let her go. She begged piteously, saying she would go home and not tell anyone of what had happened. I concluded I would not kill her and let her go. She cried murder and ran, running as fast as she could. I started after her again, concluding I would kill her, as dead people tell no tales. Accordingly, I caught her, threw her to the ground, and put my hand over her mouth to prevent her screams being heard. I placed my left hand over her mouth to prevent her from screaming, drew my knife, and with my right hand opened it with my teeth and severed her jugular vein on the right side, and then plunged the blade into the left side of her neck. I kept my hand over her mouth until her struggles ceased, and I was satisfied she was dead. My revolver was empty, both bullets having been fired into the older girl's body. I took my knife from my pocket, opened the blade, and with my hand still over the girl's mouth, cut her throat from ear to ear, holding her until she died, and keeping my hand over her mouth until death had come, for I knew Harry Knappenberger would be along soon on his way to Flag Springs to singing school, and as we were near the farm, I thought he might hear the noise. Picked her up and laid her on the ash pile. After the youngest girl had died, I arose, went to the older girl, then dead, and after taking off her underclothes, outraged her, cutting a place with my knife large enough to make an entrance. After having accomplished this, I disemboweled her so as to give the impression that she had been murdered by a crazy person. After I cut the little one's throat, I went back to the biggest one. She was lying as I left her. When I went back to the oldest one, I enlarged her with my knife and had connection with her. I went back to the least one and moved her into the weeds. I held my hand over the least one's mouth, and the older one said nothing after I shot her. I never had sexual connection with a woman in my life. I next carried the older girl's dead body to where it was found and left the cornfield. I was in the cornfield when Harry Knappenberger passed on his way to singing school and was afraid he would see me. After he passed, I got out into the main road and walked a short ways toward Flag Springs. I then climbed a fence into a pasture and woodland south of the road, walked to a small creek and washed my hands, went further down the creek, threw my knife into the creek, and went back home, went into the room and laid down, told my sister to wake me if anybody came. About sundown, Ira McLaughlin came after the little girls. I wanted to help hunt them. My folks would not let me, as they thought I was sick. They do not know I committed the crime. I never would have told it, but you described to me so nearly how I did it that I thought you must have seen me. I told the little girls There were better hazelnuts up there in the corn, and they went with me. I told them that there were young rabbits out in the corn, and they went with me to see. The little girls had their hats off when I came to them. They said they laid them down to keep them from getting spoiled. I split the little girl open after I accomplished my work to make people believe some crazy man had killed them. I did not try to shoot the little girl. I put the balls in the pistol Monday morning. The clothing I have on now are the same I wore that day. There was no blood on my person, saving on my hands. None of my clothing was bloody, except my shirt and drawers. I washed the blood out of my shirt in cold water, and, after drying it, put it away where it was found Friday. The knife with which I murdered the younger girl I threw into the water when I washed my hands. If I were to try, I could not tell what possessed me to commit the crime. I had no object, and a minute before I did it, had not thought of it. I ascribed the entire occurrence to the whiskey I drank. I do not want to live, nor do I expect to. What I have done deserves death, and speedy death. I do not want to die at the hands of a mob. It will be no credit to a mob to hang me. I am willing to go out right now with the sheriff and allow him to put a rope about my neck and end my existence. I am ready, and as soon as I have the opportunity, will plead guilty to the crime and ask to be hanged. To say I regret what I did expresses it but feebly. It is useless now to say what my feelings are regarding the matter. Perhaps you can imagine, in a very slight degree, what I have undergone since that fatal Sunday, but I doubt it. I will not inflict upon you a description of my sufferings. They will soon be ended and ought to be. The girls were nice little girls, both of them, and were good friends to me. They respected me and trusted me. I am ready to die whenever the sheriff or proper authorities say so, if that is within the next few minutes. I want a speedy trial so that I can be put out of the way as soon as possible, but let it be done by the law and not by a mob. This is all the favor I ask, and I have hardly any reason to expect that this will be granted me. End of confession. After making his confession, the young man was taken from the Savannah jail and brought to the one in St. Joseph to better protect him from a lynch mob. It was in the middle of the night, and the paper said Bateman looked considerably worn and haggard. He remained calm, but was showing signs of breaking under the strain. He was so afraid of the mob that he threatened suicide and was kept under watch. Because of his presence in St. Joe, the inmates in the jail were terrified. They were afraid the mob, which was considerably larger outside than in Savannah, would force their way in and mistake one of them for Bateman, or kill all the inmates for good measure. It was claimed the news of Bateman's arrival in St. Joseph caused the greatest excitement since the Ford boys were jailed there for the murder of Jesse James in 1882. Again, I refer to the papers. The matter was almost the sole topic of conversation the entire day, and in every instance words failed to express the indignation and horror felt by everyone. It was the unanimous sentiment that no punishment could be severe enough for the inhuman fiend who perpetrated the crime, one of the most brutal and sickening ever recorded. Bateman was secreted away from the jail and then sent back to Savannah for his appearance before a judge. On October 3rd, he pled guilty and reaffirmed his desire to be executed. He was examined by 3 doctors, and they all pronounced him perfectly sane. Dr. W. H. Bryant of Savannah stated to the court, just as responsible as anybody. He has a low order of instinctive desire through animal lust. When asked how he came to kill the girls, he said he did not know, and that the desire came upon him on seeing them in the cornfield. There is nothing in it, just one of his stories. Throughout the ordeal, the two principal families were in great turmoil. None of Bateman's family would go see him in jail until his father went on the eve of his son's execution. His mother tried to commit suicide with laudanum. The little girl's mother and an older daughter appeared to others to have gone insane. They carried on outside, yelling and demanding a lynching. Mrs. McLaughlin even turned on her husband and clubbed him since he was willing to let the law run its course. One of the daughters was found collapsed and helplessly lying on the road. She and her mother were brought home and kept under watch. Some still believed Newton Bateman was involved in the murders. Mrs. McLaughlin wanted him hanged as well, but the sheriff was satisfied that Oliver acted alone. A gallows was built just outside of Savannah. Oliver professed faith in jail. He wrote a letter of apology to the McLaughlins, and on November 22, 1884, at 12:57 p.m., in front of a crowd of 12,000, including women, children, and the McLaughlins, he was executed. He died by strangulation because when he dropped through the trap door, being on the thin side, his neck did not break. After several minutes of strangulation by the rope, no heartbeat could be detected. Oliver Bateman, killer of two little girls, was dead. His father brought his body back to the farm, where he told people he would bury it in a secret location. A wise decision, since why should such a foul murderer stain the hallowed ground of the very cemetery his little victims were laid to rest in, nay, where one, because of his actions, was exhumed shortly after being buried the first time. No, Oliver's body was brought back to the farm. Oddly enough, however, that very night people could see a roaring fire on the Bateman farm. No one knew for sure, but it was believed that the shamed family cremated Oliver's body. That was not to be the end, though, of rumors and suffering. The Gazette newspaper reported an outlandish claim by unnamed sources who said the reason the little girls were killed was because when they went to the Bateman house, they saw Oliver having relations with his 18-year-old sister Libby. They said Oliver killed the girls in order to prevent them from reporting what they saw. How could anyone make such an incredible claim and expect anyone to believe it? Well, as destructive as this would be for Libby Bateman, the source claimed it was well known in those parts that she was pregnant. And not just pregnant by Oliver. Whatever the truth was, the Bateman family sued the paper and won a monetary settlement, which was subsequently overturned on appeal. I'm sure there were a lot of stories, suspicions, and persistent questions floating around in those days. Two families were ripped open. Neighbors whose children went to the same school and who shared the same work in the fields. Yet as tragic as it all was, eventually the dust settled, the corn was harvested, and the business of farming continued from one generation to the next. The most stark and sad reminder of the crime is the shared monument for the sisters Osti and Adela, standing in lonely vigil in one of the most obscure cemeteries in the United States. Personally, I do not believe the girls were killed because they, a 7- and 9-year-old, walked in on something. It's possible the person who spread this rumor was unable to comprehend that the motive was a lust murder. Let's now take a look at the details of the crime and the confession. Naturally, I'm speculating, and others may view Oliver's behavior and statements differently. The unfortunate thing is there is a big blind spot insofar as what the family might have known about Oliver and yet were quiet about. There may have been incidents that would be all telling, but if there were any truth to the story about he and his sister, I could not find any history that they may have provided. It's curious that there was a luring story about Newton, but in terms of its effect on Oliver, it's unknown. That leaves us with the crime itself and the confessions as reported on. Here goes. First of all, I categorically reject that he was intoxicated that day. A newspaper reported their view that Oliver lied frequently, and his story of obtaining whiskey on that Sunday from a passing drunk was a ridiculous lie. To me, he made the lie even less believable when he said that after drinking in the afternoon, the devil got in him. Of course, that's straight out of the kind of thing he heard in Sunday sermons or from his anti-alcohol father. Which is strange, his making a feeble excuse. He knew he would hang and he positively welcomed getting it over with, and yet he was trying to save face by creating a false version of himself. Moving on, Oliver stated the girls visited at the house. After the girls left, he went outside and followed after them. Why in the world would he follow after them when they left to go home? He claimed he had no thought of committing the crime up until the very moment, and yet admits, once he caught up with them, to using deceit to get them to go deeper into the cornfield to see rabbits, further away from where they might be seen and heard. Also, he brought with him both his loaded gun and pocket knife. Clearly, he was prepared. He claims he propositioned the 9-year-old, but this seems fanciful on his part, if by proposition he means he asked her politely for her consent. More typically, he would have tried grabbing onto her and ordering her to comply with his demands, only to be met with fear and resistance once the attempt began. He probably threatened her, or both of them, with punishment, but she understood intuitively that she and her sister needed to leave the cornfield and get back on the road. However, Oliver said that she was indignant at his proposition, and so he became angry at being rejected. Keep in mind, he is 22 years old and she was 9. I find it hard to believe he got angry at being rejected when he specifically took them out to where rejection would not be an issue. I don't think it was spur of the moment, as though he never thought about committing the crime before. Could he know they would visit that day? I don't know, yet conveniently they turned up on a day when his stern parents were not at home, nor were many people typically around out in the fields. He had his concerns only about one neighbor at a certain time, so clearly this was thought out, at least in terms of his belief that there was a way to get away with it, or so he thought. It really wasn't thought out in terms of a master crime, though, with a solid alibi, since the evidence was so easily discovered and the cover-up, or so-called attempt, to make it look like the act was perpetrated by a crazy man was so useless to him. So again, he says he was angry at being rejected, almost as though she were not a child but a young woman his age. I think rather that if he was angry, it's because controlling 2 smart little girls was not as easy as he thought it would be. As a result, there may have been a struggle, maybe one kicked him. If she understood what he requested at that age and said no, he may have said, "Have it your way," and shot her. Or equally possible, there was no altercation and he just shot her as they were walking along after he got up the nerve. Then there is this weird moment where he claims that after she was shot, she turned to look him in the face without uttering a sound. This sounds deceptive, or some portion of it. The .22 bullet did not kill her on the spot, but being a small girl, an intra-abdominal injury would have been immediately painful. The noise would have been frightening, and typically a person looks at where they are hurt, checking the injury. I don't know, maybe she was being defiant or thought to give her sister a chance to run, but his version of her being shot standing there and turning to look at him in the face is very strange because the bullet went through her flesh, internal organs, and stopped near her spine. The indictment described it as a mortal wound on its own, a full 6 inches deep. In any case, the question is, was the attack going to plan? Had he intended to murder them all along? Maybe there really wasn't much of a plan other than the assault and murder. He didn't need the gun, but I think it played a role in the decision to commit the crime. He enjoyed the power and the violence it provided. So at this point, Osti was either already on the ground or with the second shot, now to her head, she dropped. Fine, he thought, he could go about his business. But then, according to his story, Adela ran, so he had to chase after her. Interestingly, he referred to her as the least one. That's biblical language, by the way, and it sounds so weird and dehumanizing in this situation, meaning there is a front runner and then a smaller, less important person, the least one. So here Oliver is in the middle of his confession of pure evil, and he explains that when he caught Adela, he took pity on her. He tells the sheriff he showed compassion by his willingness to trust her to be quiet and then let her go. Unless he was in some confused state, it's doubtful this little interaction revealing a kind heart ever took place. He may have felt crummy that he had to kill her, but he was never going to let her go after he killed Osti. To be blunt, if he were to kill the one, death was a package deal. It's happened many times in lovers' lane killings or home assaults when the male is in the way and the female is the primary objective. The way this works is the male is almost always killed first, so he can't defend the female or otherwise disrupt the process, unless part of the process is to make him watch and suffer, or hear and suffer. That's happened as well when the male is tied up nearby. In this case, Oliver killed first the object of his primary interest, or so he says. Now it has me wondering if the order of execution according to Oliver was true or not, because it almost allowed the little girl to escape. Whatever the case, Oliver pointed out in other interviews that at the time he was making his decision about Adela's life, he was reminded of the saying, "Dead men tell no tales," so he killed her. Yeah, that's cold. He killed a 7-year-old as collateral damage so she wouldn't talk. That is, if he's telling the truth in his confession. What a sick freak either way. In order to keep her quiet, he brutally killed the little girl by plunging the knife first in one side of her neck, opening the artery creating a fountain, and then the other side of the neck, while at the same time keeping a hand gripped hard over her mouth and holding her down. Not even turned over. He's looking at her and she's looking at him until she finally stopped breathing. This is an absolutely horrendous double killing. It's worse than the 1892 Borden murders 8 years later in Fall River, Massachusetts. When Mr. and Mrs. Borden were slain with a hatchet, they likely never knew what hit them, but it lacked a conviction, so it is more famous. Continuing, after Adela stopped breathing, he claimed, if the order of all this is true, he carried her about 100 yards, maybe it was 150 yards away, and hit her on an ash pile. That is a really long distance to carry a second murder victim, holding her intimately close, and offhand, I can't think of another double murder I've heard of like this in that respect. What was he thinking while he was carrying her so far away from her sister? It maybe had to do with hiding her and taking precautions, but maybe he didn't want her dead eyes and ears near him and Osti, where he intended to complete his objective. Or he didn't carry her the whole way. She ran part of the way until he caught her. In any case, he leaves her in the distance. Then he goes back to Osti's dead body, where he says he removed her underclothes. What happened next was an extremely bizarre, brutal, horrifying, and rare thing to do. He created an opening. He states in the official confession that he made an entrance and had connection with her. According to him, she was fully dead, with a big, awful hole in her head, and he does this. At the time, it was beyond anything people could comprehend. This was his motivation for the whole thing. In an unofficial jailhouse confession with a reporter, he said he attempted an outrage and was unsuccessful, then with his knife made an entrance and was unsuccessful again. This is not what he confessed to the sheriff. He said he had connection. So I think even though he was going to die, he was once again trying to save face just a tiny bit by sitting in jail and claiming it wasn't really an outrage, but rather an attempted one. The fact is he murdered her and cut her open for his stated purpose, regardless of how far he got. When he finished, he then gave her 3 long, deep slashes, opening her up above the slash he used for connection. I can see someone arguing that he did that because he was angry and frustrated with the corpse and the experience. Yet he stated officially it was staging. He did it to make it look like a crazy person murdered her. I think there is a real possibility that covering up the opening was his reason. The more slashes, the less his first one would register as an artificial body part. But the county sheriff and doctor figured out what that was for, and maybe that's because there was additional evidence at the scene. Perhaps the long cuts expressed some pent-up rage at females as well, but that side of him was kept hidden, even in the confession, making a point to say he never had sex with a woman. It's interesting, though, that he thought he could make it look like a crazy person killed her. Actually, Oliver, they figured out you did it and you were not crazy. What do penetrating wounds on the victim say about you? Another dilemma, so to speak, in the confession is he claimed to have thrown the knife in the creek, leaving it there. He brought it home and hid it, just as he hid the pistol, so the find in the house of his murder weapon proved he lied in his confession. He was asked about the lie in jail and never explained, never offered a reason of how the knife might have got inside the house, whether he put it there or someone else did. I think he liked that knife and clung to the idea that they had not found it. Maybe if it was not presented physically to him, he thought they were lying about finding it. He didn't question that they found the other evidence, so it's just one of those things. He was also called out on the fact that his brother was accused first, and he was nearly lynched, and yet Oliver did not try to save him by confessing earlier. Of course not. He was just a lowlife who would have let his own brother hang in his place. I don't think he would have ever confessed if the evidence had not proved so withering. In the end, we have to take his storyline of the crime with skepticism. On top of everything else, he may have lied about shooting Osti before the assault. It is something that should be looked at with careful consideration, given he lied elsewhere in the confession. As horrifying as it is to contemplate, the knife mutilations on Osti's body, the hole and the long deep slashes, could have been pre or simultaneous with the assault. The gunshots, especially the headshot, could very well have been at the end, not the beginning. They would bleed more if she wasn't dead, and he may have gotten kicks from the blood. If it were today, forensics and the medical examiner would have had a much better idea of what happened in what order. So to sum up, I think Oliver Bateman was thinking of this type of crime for a long time, and it had a powerful hold on him. There may have been other crimes that went unreported, for instance with his sisters, at another home, or among children during harvest time, when he could have scurried away with one. Regarding religion, Oliver said he left the Baptist church because he wasn't good enough, yet it was said he also retired from general society and normal pursuits for his age. In all probability, he quit the Baptist church because his warped fantasies became too important to him, not that he was bothered by guilt. Going to church, social functions, and dances reminded him of the conflict and may have intensified his strange bouts of illness. Therefore, he wanted to keep his fantasies free and unobstructed. We are not talking about normal desires, or the heavy guilt and worry some Christians feel over having desires at all. It's true, there are many believers who wish they could be celibate and unbothered by physical needs, because with those thoughts they feel they are constantly sinning and inflicting pain on their Savior. The stern preaching against self-abuse in Oliver's day left many with feelings of depression and worthlessness, or they married early to avoid temptation. Oliver's desires were deeply abnormal, which he knew were incompatible with the rest of society as well, not just the beliefs of the local Baptist church, which of course preached a 19th century message of hell and damnation for much lesser offenses than murder. Of course, I must state the obvious. Just because someone leaves the church, it does not mean they are a sadist, a sex offender, or a psychopath. There are innumerable reasons why people intellectually or emotionally disengage from religion and social activities, crime being an unlikely reason. Likewise, a religious background does not have to play any role in crimes like Oliver's. The clue to antisocial mental pathologies are not always visible, yet common sense must be applied in determining the degree of concern if a young person lies a great deal, is obsessed with drawing scenes of hyper-violence against enemies or objects of lust, or if they are filling a journal with the word hate on nearly every page. It would not surprise me if Oliver created a secret journal expressing his delusions, his superior ego, his desires, and his hatreds, with anger directed at his mother and or his father. Strangely enough, some people even lie in their own journals to make others look worse and themselves better. So while we may think a journal by Oliver Bateman would have provided great insights, instead he may have embellished and changed reality to suit a better picture of himself. Regarding that unspecified illness, again, I think he either pretended to be sick or made a small condition worse, using it as an excuse to disengage with the normal progression of life. Regarding the double murder, he wasn't smart at all because certain individuals knew he had an unusual pistol, yet he chose to use it anyway. He wasn't brilliantly organized because he left the bodies where they could be found. For that matter, he left the gun where it could be found. Did the police dig up the whole farm? No, but they were watching, and they saw his mother bury a box of cartridges where the gun was buried, so she led them to it. All I can make of it is that Oliver thought, if he was ever suspected, that he had a strong alibi and he could claim he was too sick and drunk to commit the murders. Remember what the paper said? He was the last person to be suspected. He had his act and his story down. He believed his affable, unfazed manner would work to his advantage as well. He just didn't count on the several pieces of overwhelming evidence to work against him: the time, the location, the opportunity, the boot print, the gun, the knife, and the bloodied shirt. I must say good job to Missouri law enforcement, the prosecutor, and the second medical examiner too. They nailed him. What's more, the sheriff's department kept a mob at bay before anyone was lynched, going to extraordinary efforts to protect the prisoner so that the court could complete its lofty duty. Of course, Oliver Bateman claimed to be suffering greatly from guilt, but I don't believe that at all, not based on other killers like him. He was expressing sentiments he thought were expected of him. If you recall, when the serial killer Israel Keyes was caught, he committed suicide in jail. Many others have too. Not before getting caught and going to jail, no, after getting caught, exposed, and incarcerated. Their fantasy life and their murders are what they lived for. It was as valuable to them as a room full of gold. Left with chump change, they suffered not for their victims, but for their own selfish desires being denied. With nothing to live for, humiliated, defeated child killer Oliver Bateman would have killed himself too. In the end, what can we really say about violent offenders like this? They lack empathy for their victims. They are psychopaths and liars, and are not fit for human society. If Bateman had not been caught, there is a strong possibility he would have killed again, learned from his mistakes, and moved on. Are there other individuals today looking for the right opportunity to present itself? You better believe it. There have been a lot of crimes of opportunity in recent years. Joggers, young people walking alone. You can probably think of some, if not the names. I don't have to tell you their families have not forgotten. One last thing, though, looking at the traumatic case of the McLaughlin girls, there have not been many sex assaults that involve the opening of the body to create a mutilation sex orifice. Almost none that I know of except for Bateman and the Black Dahlia Killer. In 1947 in Los Angeles, a sex fiend with a strong fetish component did the same thing. He created an opening in her pelvis. While the Elizabeth Short case does not have a convicted suspect like Oliver Bateman, offenders like Bateman and the fetish killer of the Black Dahlia are among us. Until next time, stay safe, and that especially goes for those of you in quiet, wholesome, lightly populated, crime-free, supposedly crime-free rural districts. Without question, there is someone somewhere sitting at home as unsuspecting and terrifying as Oliver Bateman, hoping to get started. Or he's out driving around to see what turns up. So be careful. Thank you so much for listening, and I really appreciate those that leave a like so that this program can build and be seen by others.